let us move to the discussion that is dominating headlines in Washington and New York and perhaps even London. And the discussion is that under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India is turning into a Hindu majoritarian, a Hindu fascist, a Hindu supremacist state. Indian democracy is backsliding. Minorities are under threat. The constitution may be upended. There are all sorts of narratives that bubble up. And my question to you is actually something slightly different. My question to you is that for all the narrative, it seems that Modi was ahead in the polls. He may win an unprecedented third term, or I shouldn't say unprecedented. Jawaharlal Nehru won a third term too, so he'll only be the second prime minister after 1947 to do so. He'll equal that record if the opinion polls hold true. Opinion polls before the election, that is.
Prior to the election.
In India, it is illegal to publish opinion polls after the elections. So we are referring to opinion polls before the elections.
Yes.
So should that stand, forget all the talk of East Coast media. Let's focus on more substantively, what would be the policies a third-term Modi government would enact in, say, economics, number one. Number two, defense and diplomacy. Or rather, number two, let's go to domestic matters. And then number three, defense and diplomacy. So let's tackle these three. Economics, domestic matters, defense and diplomacy. Shoot, sir.
Yeah, yes. Prior to answering the upcoming policy thrusts, I would like to also add in a bit of masala, since this is a talk show about the Indian election and the spices.
We have to have masala chai. We can't have your Italian cappuccino. That won't suffice.
So to add to just to add the masala, especially about the East Coast media and a lot of speculation amongst a certain section. Think of it this way, that there is a media that professes to be independent, neutral, and they say that they have, they just inquiring, as to what's going on. So basically where they're coming from is from a position of goodwill. And I actually accept that. I feel that, they're well-meaning. But there is a fundamental lack of understanding, I guess, of the matter that they're reporting. When there is a question of democratic backsliding, think of it this way. India was a very close pal of Soviet Union. Hardly, it was hardly a shining pillar of democracy in the world. But it didn't become an autocratic country, influenced by the Soviet ideals or the Soviet policies. It did follow a lot of economic policies from Soviet Union, but it didn't go that way. Today, you have a different political party.
Rather, if I may add, Manu, and reveal my sensibilities and my proclivities and my inclinations, those economic policies were disastrous.
They were disastrous, yes.
They used socialist policies through a colonial bureaucracy.
The best of all worlds. But, so this is for the viewers and for the media folks who would like to, go deeper. Dial back to 1975 when then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi enacted something
a great lover of the Soviets. She declared us to be a socialist country through a constitutional amendment of dubious validity.
Yes, which, by the way, came during this so-called emergency. So she implemented something called the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, or MISA.
That lovely act.
Yes. Under that, basically, entire
MISA sounds such an innocent name for a young girl.
Well, Uh, I mean, iron fist in a velvet glove. So, so overnight, entire Indian opposition was jailed. Uh, and by opposition, I mean the party in power. So basically, all the big BJP leaders that you see today were in jail.
The current party in power was then in
Yes, the
opposition,
current
to
party in
clarify
power
for our
was then
viewers and
opposition.
listeners. Yeah,
Yes, yes. So they were in jail, and they were in jail for 2 years, from 75 to 77.
yeah.
They had no contact with the outside world in the sense of, uncensored contact. Their letters were censored. Their meetings were heavily monitored. The telephone lines were heavily monitored across the
But tapped.
country. Yes,
Yeah.
they were
And
tapped.
remember, those were
And
days, just for our viewers and listeners, those were days when we didn't have fancy mobiles. You dialed a number and it went round. So you dialed 1, 2, 3, and then there was a
and
line with like
indeed, and
Blackadder.
exactly. And yes, yes, good old days. And also the fact that there were very few telephone lines in the first place. So
That's true.
you had a primary means of communication being heavily monitored. You had letters, which was another form of communication, heavily censored.
Also monitored because it was run by the
Yes,
post office, which was
post
state
offices,
owned.
which was government.
Yeah.
You look at the only radio network
All
in the
India Radio.
country, All India Radio, that was state owned, under the control of the state. You had the only television network, the Doordarshan, or DD as it's called, again under the state control.
Yeah, run
And
by an IAS officer, the Indian Administrative Service
yes,
officers who control
yes.
everything.
So basically, here was this here was this situation that every opposition leader in jail, every means of communication controlled, all mass communication platforms also controlled, newspapers censored, printing presses
Correct.
being again censored and overseen. And Mrs. Gandhi thought that it would be good time to have an election in 77. Her advisors told her that if we go to the polls now, you would win. But guess what? She lost. Indian voters with
She
no
should have rigged the
access.
election. Why didn't she do that?
It's primarily because if she couldn't do it, there is little
It's too
chance.
difficult. Yeah,
Yes. And that's what I was coming to, that
yeah,
that amongst all of this, the wisdom of Indian electorate gets discounted.
yeah.
How is it that people with no access to any other information source, you know, look at the political situation, form an opinion, quietly come out on the day of voting and vote out the most powerful politician the country has ever seen?
That's true.
And
That's true.
also,
People talk about Narendra Modi. I mean, Narendra Modi is a child compared to Indira Gandhi. Remember the comment? Uh, Indira is India and India is Indira,
India is Indira.
and
Yes,
people used to worship her as a goddess. And she had won the 1971 war, and
split
there were
Pakistan
people
into
who,
two.
yeah, there were people who thought she was literally a goddess and a
So
personification of India.
exact, and she strode the political scene like a colossus, and even she got
Yes.
voted out. So, so to my colleagues in the Western press, I would say, look at the flow of history. Look at how the Indian electorate has historically performed its solemn duty towards the nation, and perhaps you'll find your answers whether India is backsliding or is just a normal political process playing out, and it will play out, to its full maturity cycle.
So it's just a cycle, you're saying.
It's
It's
just a
just a
cycle.
cycle in the grand old Indian transmigration of souls.
Yeah, something actually very philosophical about it. I agree.
All right. You've answered or you've tackled the Western bit, which was
Yeah.
almost a prelude to my question. Let's talk about the three things.
Yes.
I'll not let you forget them:
Yeah. Indeed.
economics, domestic matters, defense, and diplomacy. Shoot.
So when it comes to economics, the priority for the government is to generate jobs and to ensure that India becomes a manufacturing power. Now, the traditional bottlenecks that were stopping those were infrastructure and power infrastructure. Um,
Yeah,
so
basically
transport,
electricity
yes,
and
transport and
transport.
energy. These were two issues for the Indian manufacturers. They are on the verge of being resolved or have already been resolved. Now the question is about the factor pricing or factor inputs, which includes capital, the cost of capital, and the
Which
cost
is
of
higher in
labor.
India than
Yes,
many other countries.
yes, and cost of labor. Now, when you say cost of capital, there is also an inclusion of the cost of land, which is very expensive. And the government may come out with policies to deal with that, because what happens is that a lot of manufacturing companies lose significant amount of money in just acquiring the land for creating a manufacturing plant, which doesn't happen with most other East Asian economies. So the benchmark for the current government, and if indeed they come to power again, would be the East Asian performance benchmarks. And uh, I've been informed that the government would try all to basically equal or better those benchmarks when it comes to the economy.
I see. So
Yeah.
you're alluding to major reforms um, in land records, in land governance, in land rights, all of that, property
Uh,
rights, really.
I'm not privy to any specific policy maneuvers, but on a broad swath, I think factor pricing is something, or the input pricing is something that the government is immensely concerned about. And that indeed could prove to be the difference between India becoming a middle income state, or, struggling at its lower middle income status.
Okay, so that's on the economics side. But before we move on, one thing to observe about land in India is that records are poor, that property is really overpriced and it's a tax on the middle class. Apartments cost an arm and a leg. A lot of money in land and property is transacted in the black, meaning the official price would be, say, 1 million, and the apartment or the flat will sell for 3 million or 4 million. And the difference between the official and the real price would be off the books. So all these are major problems, and this highly expensive price of property is perhaps the biggest tax on the middle class, which pays a lot for literally very poor public infrastructure. Indian cities look like war zones. The traffic is terrible, there are hardly any parks, the planning is poor, the drainage systems are inadequate. I could go on. And there are plumbing issues, so on and so forth. A little bit of rain and everything overflows. So the system, the design, the systemic design for land governance is far from adequate. So the challenges are huge, and in your judgment, you think the government, if it gets the third term, would go for solving such a big challenge or for taking on such a big challenge.
Indeed, I mean, without resolving that, the ability of India to approach East Asian levels of productivity in certain sectors of the economy. Now, don't mistake it for like an across the board equalization of, there are some things that only East Asian economies can manage, and there are other things whereby
Such as making high quality semiconductors. Only Taiwan can really do it.
That and also, mass production of certain items, which they are very good at, and there is already sunk capital there.
Correct. And
But
and
but
and the
India
expertise
is
built over time.
competitive. Yes, but India
Yeah.
is competitive on high technology and, let us say, medium technology items, and that would be the
Chemicals.
niche to explore and exploit
Yeah.
for the country.
Excellent. And you see movement there. So, okay, fine. What about domestic matters?
See, domestic matters, I think the biggest issue or challenge for India is civic management, making cities, building cities that are livable.
The cities are unlivable as of now.
Current,
Delhi is the most polluted
yeah,
city in the world.
currently, with the GDP of 2,400, $2,500 US per capita, uh, the Indian cities don't look half bit as good as the Chinese used to look when they were at the same per capita income levels, which was sometime, I guess, in the 2000s. And that is sort of the benchmark that some of the Indian cities have to be, really leapfrogged to that status. Now, how that would come about, whether it would need some political changes, some economic thrusts, or some special incentive schemes, that remains to be seen. But domestically, I think the thrust will be on creating cities that are engines of
Better
growth
cities,
and they are
better run
livable.
cities.
Yes.
Better run cities, livable cities. Now, you obviously live in one such city, Chandigarh, beautifully planned, green. I have heard repeated rumors from both people in the opposition and people in the government, I mean at the national level, that the third term Modi led BJP government might convert cities like Chennai, like Mumbai, like Kolkata, like Bangalore into union territories like Chandigarh and polish these cities and try and make them mini Singapores or mini Hong Kongs where you have roads and parks and buses and metros, better waste collection, better drainage, cleaner water, and so on and so forth. Do you think there might be a move in this direction after the elections?
You see, changing the political status of these big cities, which have come to identify with the states they're in, would be a political hot potato. If indeed such a thing were to be envisaged by the government, they could only do it if they have a supermajority or
I
huge
see.
number of seats. Number one. Number two is that creating livable cities may not necessarily, and a good example is Chandigarh. The city was created out of scratch. So
Yes, you're
basically,
right,
that,
actually.
yeah,
It was farmland, really.
yes, yeah. So there could be another, style of getting that done, which would be to create greenfield cities, new cities that are livable, that are designed from bottoms up to be, cities that can match bigger metros in the world and attract talent and capital there.
Now, if I may very quickly remind our viewers and listeners about a time in history, which you and I are slightly familiar with. We are not historians of the period, but still we take an interest in it. Kolkata or Calcutta appeared as one such greenfield city under the British East India Company. So did Madras, now called Chennai. So did Bombay, now called Mumbai. In fact, Mumbai was transferred by the Portuguese to the British as dowry when Catherine of Braganza married Charles II, if I remember correctly. So all these at the time were greenfield cities. And they, of course, as the British came to control India, there was the British East India Company, and then the British Crown ruled India, these became the leading cities of the land. So cities have sprung and cities have fallen over the 3 millennia of Indian history. The ruins of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Lothal, Dholavira, and I could go on, are all testimony to that fact. So, domestic matters, very good. They have to sort out the urban problem, make cities livable, fine. What about defense and diplomacy? Right now, if you read the Washington Post and you read the BBC, there's a lot of reporting of Indian secret agents running around killing Sikh separatists, or what the Indians would call terrorists. And of course, Canada has arrested 3 people for that killing. The US has seen the Washington Post carry a big story blaming the Indian government for trying to be too James Bondish on American soil against American citizens. So it is a very curious time in defense and diplomacy. What do you foresee in the third term?
Well, India inhabits a very dangerous neighborhood, and
Surely not, surely not. We only have Pakistan and we only have China, two lovely, cuddly teddy bear-like countries. One to the west and one to the east. And the nuclear weapons they have are all, they're just for show. They're very reasonable. They will never use it against India.
I guess India perhaps
Use them against India. I said they will never use them against India.
Hopefully that remains the case in the future. And that sort of ties back into the reporting that's being carried out in the various Western media outlets. The fundamental problem, I think, that's emerging is that the Western establishment sees a lot of people as political dissidents. India sees them as terrorists, and that's where the two begin to diverge. The understanding within the Indian establishment for long has been that if India behaves like Japan of South Asia, that is, it doesn't have an independent defense or foreign policy, then things would become much smoother. But with that also comes the fact that they may not end up becoming a Japan. They may end up becoming another country that gets ditched, right at the moment of, let's say, a conflict with China or with Pakistan. So as of now, there are certain core interests which both the parties are not willing to abandon. The sense, I guess, in the Western circles is that they've mollycoddled and they've been too soft with the Modi administration over the past few years, so they need to really, deliver a hard message. The sense within the Indian establishment, there was always this school of thought that said that too close an embrace of the West would not be very useful for India. And as of now, both of these schools of thought are, enjoying their what you can call prominence, and it remains to be seen whether this is a short-term rise in emotions or whether this will be a prolonged one. If it remains a prolonged one, we would see certain dialing back of relations between the West and India. But if it's really a short-term thing, then I guess it will be business as usual within months.
So that addresses diplomacy vis-a-vis the West. We haven't quite touched upon India's defense challenges with its near neighbors, and they don't just exist with Pakistan and China. India faces challenges even when it comes to Myanmar.
Yes,
Myanmar is going through massive insurgency, massive conflict, which is undercovered or not quite covered
underreported.
adequately, either in India or elsewhere. Uh, India faces challenges with the radicalization of Maldives, Nepal. Afghanistan is not too far away from India, lest we forget the first time there was an invasion in Kashmir. It was Pashtun tribesmen, and many of them were from Afghanistan. So India has a rough neighborhood, and when it comes to the defense front, what are the challenges there, and how is India going to shape its diplomacy in its near neighborhood, in Asia, and let's say its relations with major powers such as France, Japan, Israel, and even Russia.
So the Indian establishment, has always found it far more reassuring to engage with what it deems as the middle powers of the world. The ones that are not overbearing, that are transactional, and at times understand the impulses, or what you can call the imperatives of Indian geopolitical reality. So France is one of them. For example, when India tested a nuclear device in 1998, France was not really vociferous in its condemnation. In fact, it kind of shrugged and said, "Yeah, we understand." So that, and even if we dial back further, since the days of 70s, 60s, French have had a long-term relationship with India's defense industry and no record of sanctions or policy flip-flops. Similarly speaking, with Japan, India has had a very deep economic relationship, although it is interspersed with certain uh, timestamps, when the Japanese had to yield to the pressure of the Western allies, when it came to the nuclear explosions, or when it came to wars between India and Pakistan. So other than that, the relationship has been fine. Now India is also engaging Greece, which is another middle power, and in a way, when you perceive from the Indian side, it's the doorway to the entire European continent, and is a major economic hub in the emergence from our perspective. So India will keep on engaging the middle class with, I guess, increased fervor, because that's what they see. Another good example is UAE in the Arabian Peninsula. India has a very deep relationship with the country, and it's a symbiotic relationship. That they gain stuff that they don't have, India gains stuff that it doesn't have, and both of them.
A lot of Indians live in Dubai, some of the richest.
Yes, yes. So, so that is kind of the template that India is looking forward to, of engaging middle powers more, not being dependent on one or two countries, which basically introduces a systemic risk, whereby one or two events or incidents could just bring the house down. That's not something that India is now. You know, it's something that India will keep a part of its calculations.
Yeah, defense, the risk from powers such as China, Pakistan, and of course, I mentioned Nepal and Maldives
See, clearly,
and
clearly, when it
Myanmar.
comes to Pakistan, see, when it comes to Pakistan and China, now there is an understanding that they should be seen as a joint question, that has to be addressed, because at times what the Chinese don't want to do directly, they can have it done through Pakistan and vice versa. So India is evaluating the world after 2020, post Galvan crisis, when they understood that merely trade deals or economic linkages do not translate into lasting peace or security. Uh,
So just so that our viewers and listeners around the world know, The incident Manu has just referred to is the 2020 clash, if I remember correctly, between Indian and Chinese troops, which led to a number of soldiers and officers dying on both sides. And it was a rather grim and brutal clash, triggered, of course, by the Chinese, who provoked and began the killings.
So, post that, India had to recalibrate its China strategy and understand or wake up to the new reality, which was that deeper economic linkages or trade linkages do not necessarily guarantee a peaceful border. And ever since, there are two schools of thought. One says, let's go back to the good old days, treat this incident as an aberration. The other one says, no, let's be pragmatic and, uh, we should now proceed with due caution because, and here's the point, that in 1960s, 50s, India was the more prominent Asian player, and Mao was struggling, in dousing his civil war and coming to full grips with the country and its
Well,
territory.
the Great Leap Forward was an unmitigated disaster.
Disaster,
Millions
yes,
died.
yeah. And sort of during that, Nehru and Mao went to war in 1962 over,
Just after a famine, actually.
yes, and the PLA turned out to be better prepared, and at the same time, there was little appetite, and I would say ideological appetite within the um, Indian establishment to, fight a prolonged war against China, and so China kind of became the predominant military power in Asia after the 1962 crisis, and it has been like that since. So, uh, there is this sense amongst the Chinese that India might be trying to revise the old power equations by trying to emerge as a manufacturing destination, by trying to revitalize its economy, upping its defensive posture along the entire Himalayan belt. So, a school of thought within China believes or thinks that that India should actually remain in its corner and not aspire for a wider role. So, from that perspective, I think India's rise won't go unchallenged by uh, the Chinese uh, establishment. So there is a possibility or a probability, I would say, of some kind of a conflict in the future to preempt, what they perceive would be India's rise,
Basically, a slap on the wrist.
kind of.
Yeah. But, if that happens, do you see that probability rising in Modi's third term, or is it something which may happen 5 years now, or from now, or 10 years from now? Or do you think the window is now, as in next year?
You see, the window would actually depend upon, I mean, a lot of factors. It really can't be predicted whether it be 5 years or 1 year. But what can be teased out, from the situation, from the commentary, from the entire environment in which the current geopolitics is, that India is in a hurry to be in a better position defensively in the region, and perhaps the that might uh, you know that might limit the window of opportunity for China So, for example, the 2020 Galwan crisis actually came out of nowhere uh, to a lot of people here. But now when we look at it in the hindsight, it's quite evident that because India was uh, upping its defensive posture, it was but natural for the Chinese to try something. And similar will be the case. That is not to say that India shouldn't up its defensive posture. All it means is that India needs to be just cautious.
I see. Now, we haven't yet discussed the smaller neighbors that are causing some problems, such as Maldives in the south, Nepal, sandwiched between China and India, which has had a communist government, and Myanmar in the grip of a vicious civil war, where I once served, or I didn't serve in Myanmar, but I served on the Myanmar border once upon a time.
See, with Myanmar, there is a huge problem at the civil level. There is a low intensity civil war or insurgency uh, ongoing within that country, and ever since the military coup, the situation has deteriorated, and the splash of that conflict is also reaching the Indian territories, and we've seen some of the ripples in Manipur and perhaps bits and pieces of Nagaland. Uh, but this is something that can't be addressed by without, I would say, uh, wider international intervention or framework. As of now, this is something that most powers are content, letting be on the slow boil. So the only option for India over there is to basically fortify the border and just wait it out till things stabilize.
And do you think there'll be more simmering in the coming 5 years?
Indeed, I
Yeah.
mean, it will be directly correlated to what happens there.
All
So
right.
far, so far we are seeing that the situation hasn't improved in Myanmar.
And Maldives, Nepal, any thoughts?
See, Nepal, I would say, is a very complicated relationship. It's not the normal neighborly relationship. Uh, there are ups and there are
You could
ups and
argue,
downs
you
to.
could argue India and China are playing the modern version of the great game in Nepal. Maybe, maybe
Uh,
with less glamour, but they are both trying to jostle
yeah, but
across the country.
the religious, the cultural, and the people to people linkages are just far too deep for there to be any meaningful, movement either way. As of now, what's happening in Nepal, in Maldives, is basically a smaller power playing off two big powers to maximize the material benefits that it can derive.
Maldives is
And
different, though. Maldives now has radical Islam. Is a slightly different kettle of fish to Nepal.
slightly different, but I won't say like really different
Too
because
different. Yeah.
at the end of the day, they also fall heavily under the Indian sphere of influence, and it's not impossible for India to intervene. But the good thing there is to let things be because ultimately it's about to smaller country trying to play off two big powers to maximize material benefit for for itself. And if one of the big powers just refuses to play ball, then the incentive or the competitive bidding goes down for the other power. So as simple as that.
And in the next term, you think the Modi government will manage all these three, no major changes?
No major changes, I guess. They've been very consistent.
Yeah, and no major changes either with
That can't
Pakistan
be
or
said.
China.
With Pakistan, we may see some kind of an opening, but only if there are implicit guarantees about cross-border terrorism. But with China, let's see, because they've already had these intense engagements with the political apex of the two countries, but it didn't lead to anything. In fact, it led to a conflict. So as of
Kargil,
now, there's a lot of
1998.
confusion. No, I'm talking about the Chinese and the Gulf one. So as of now, there's a lot of confusion about, despite the record number of Modi and Xi summits, nothing really came out. All we saw were, basically, a conflict high up in the Himalayas. Um, so that I guess is a spot where policy confusion would persist for a bit before it's resolved.
All right, so we've covered the entire gamut. We expect the only major change in foreign policy could to be a slight recalibration from the West if the current controversy continues and India moving closer to the middle powers. But other things are most likely to remain the same, more of the same. La plus ça change, la même c'est la chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Kerr, 1848. At least in foreign policy and diplomacy. On that note, Manu, thank you for your time. It's been fantastic talking to you. And we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.